John, and I'm going to turn it over to you. If you want to go ahead and share your screen and bring your presentation up. I would say to all the participants that we're probably going to hold questions till the end. If you have questions, Paul will be monitoring the chat box, as well as I think we'll take live questions at the end too, Paul, if someone has a question. So
yes, we'll do both, but people would rather put it in the chat, we'll make sure it gets asked and hopefully answered. Or if you'd rather ask the question directly, we'll let you open the mic at that point.
One thing we might want to mention to everybody is this is going to be recorded as well.
All right, John, we're seeing your screen.
All right, good enough. Good afternoon, everyone. John Eisenhower. I'm Technical Assistance Biologist with the Wildlife Resources Commission Private Lands Program. I work the entire 33 county Piedmont region. But I've been doing this for about 15 years now as Technical Assistance Biologist. And just so you'll know, this is not just 15 years, but also about 50 pounds and about 2 chins worth. And that's why I don't have my camera on today. So this is what I used to look like, what I look like now. Just imagine me talking as we go through the day here. So I've already heard a comment during the pre-meeting about opportunities and obstacles. And seems like one participant today actually had an obstacle with wildlife in their backyard eating hostas and maybe didn't quite have the opportunities they wanted on their tree farm as far as being able to see a few more deer. So a very interesting topic and title that the extension agents came up with. And, you know, working with private landowners for a while, it's always interesting that the same situation can mean different things to different people. And of course, how do we define opportunities and obstacles, or who defines opportunities and obstacles? And that really comes down to the landowner. What you want on your property, or as the one gentleman mentioned, what he wants on one piece of property versus the other piece of property. So, you know, in addition to opportunities and obstacles, when we start talking about wildlife management, wildlife habitat management, we have to think about some other ownership, land ownership situations. And of course, we have to talk about monetary values versus aesthetic values. And, you know, monetary value, it costs to own land. Some folks have different monetary goals than others. Intrinsic value, like the little unicorns there show, means a little bit of something different to each landowner. There again, who defines the valuations and how to come up with a management philosophy that balances monetary value and intrinsic value on private lands? And there again, the landowner is responsible for making those final decisions on what they want off of their property. And then finally, when the biology of species come into play, we have to know what each species needs to be able to define habitat. I get a lot of calls and conversations from people that say, I want to, quote, do wildlife, or I want to enhance wildlife on my property. And we could do that on any number of scales. To be able to really meet a landowner's objective, we need to know a little more about what you're wanting to accomplish on your property. Species are important. If you get the photo here that Charles has of a nice soybean field that looks real pretty behind him, aesthetics are very important to landowners as well. So there again, where do we find that balancing point between what a species needs and the aesthetics on private lands? And that all comes back down to the landowner making those decisions. So as you define your opportunities and your obstacles through this workshop series, I do hope you'll think about what you want on your property and what your resources are, what your capabilities are, what your challenges are, so that if you do seek professional assistance from a technical assistance biologist or another wildlife biologist, you can give us a good destination that you're looking for so we can come up with the right roadmap to get you there. So even though the title of this presentation, or at least in the series, was fallow and planting vegetation, we're really talking about early successional vegetation, early successional habitats. And, you know, a lot of folks wonder, why should I even care about these species, these areas? And, you know, there's a series or a suite of animals that not only live in these areas, but require early successional areas to be able to live and continue their life cycle. And the three that have popped up here now: loggerhead shrike, Bachman sparrow, field sparrow. We could add grasshopper sparrow. We could add meadowlark, and of course, we could add bobwhite quail to the list of species that require early successional habitat and whose numbers are in 50 to 70 year declines across their entire range. So the decline in early successional habitat has definitely impacted a lot of species, and you know, the bobwhite quail being a very iconic species in the South that most folks don't hear very often anymore. So if you're not interested in birds and that kind of thing, maybe you're more interested in consumptive use or hunting. Cottontail rabbits utilize these vegetation types and these habitat types. Very good nesting and foraging cover and just shelter as well. White-tailed deer will utilize early successional areas for fawning cover, for food, just bedding and general loafing cover as well. And eastern wild turkeys utilize early successional areas for nesting, but even more important, these early successional areas are grasshopper, just grasshopper factories. And especially young turkeys really need high sources of protein whenever they're brooding. So early successional habitat, early successional vegetation is really good bugging areas, good brooding areas, and good nesting areas for wild turkey. And then one of the latest and greatest things that gets a lot of attention are pollinators and other beneficial insects. And, you know, many of the early successional plants do bloom. They bloom throughout the summer and into the early fall. They provide nectar and also are host plants for a lot of butterflies, moths, that kind of thing. So, you know, from a common buckeye that might feed and get nectar from the mountain mint, carpenter bees, which don't only drill holes in your barn, they also are important pollinators that utilize maybe this butterfly weed, butterfly milkweed for nectar. The unlucky mud dauber that became lunch for the green lynx spider, or probably one of the most iconic things that gets a lot of attention, you know, the monarch butterfly feeding on common milkweed. So the importance of early successional vegetation to pollinators is very extreme. A lot of these species have to have these early successional species to reproduce. The monarch, of course, is one that is commonly known that if it doesn't have milkweed species, the larva can't feed and their life cycle can't be completed. So this would be what a typical early successional project, this would be a fairly large scale project, would look like during the fall and winter. But you know, how do we get there? And as the title of the presentation kind of indicated, there's lots of ways to get there from here. Again, a lot of it depends on what landowner goals are, landowner objectives are, and the scale of the project, what location, soil types, all the general things that you think about whenever you're considering vegetation that might produce or thrive in an area. So to begin, we're going to talk about planting native species, and I will throw an additional and naturalized species in there, and we'll talk a little more about that as we move forward with this little series of slides. And whenever we start talking about planting native wildflower species, this is what everybody thinks about. That wonderful, glorious field of wildflowers, which poppies aren't exactly native wildflowers by any means, but they did cause Dorothy a little bit of problem as they headed towards the Emerald City. But of course, this is not reality whenever it comes to planting native and naturalized wildflowers. So I wanted to go through a couple years added to it since 2018. But this is a crop field. It was about 17-acre project that had been Roundup ready. So it had had multiple herbicide treatments over the last 20 years. Came right out of crop production into our cover crop of wheat. And then we began the process of converting that to a native vegetation type. So the first step was we terminated the cover crop, added glyphosate for the foliar treatment, as well as a little bit of a mazopic, which provides about 60 days of control for lots of problematic things like crabgrass and barnyard grass, things like that. So we did that on March 29th. Gave it a little time to work and came back in on the 11th and used a Truax no-till drill to plant the species and quantities listed in the chart there that you're seeing. We planted right at 19 species of forbs, wildflowers, broadleaf species, and then the 4 species of grass that are listed there as well. So gave it about a month and a half or so, and went back and started seeing a few things popping up. You can see faint rows in that photo. Some of the more dependable species had popped up and were starting to grow. Came back a little bit later in June and started to see a few more rows evident. We were seeing some grasses pop up, as well as some of the Coreopsis and a few black-eyed Susans that were in the mix. And we did start seeing a few things starting to bloom. There again, just kind of a little snapshot as we went along about how this progressed through that first growing season. A few more, the Indian blankets, those kinds of things are popping up in late June. Starting to see a little wider spread coverage there. Going into July, lots of the Coreopsis, starting to see a few black-eyed Susans blooming as well. And then on the 13th of July, we're starting to see even more species pop up. The Maximilian sunflower is the nice pretty yellow flower there in the foreground. That species is not native to North Carolina. It generally doesn't spread aggressively. It is used by pollinators, but it's a Midwestern native. I always kind of get dinged on why we're planting ecotypes or we're planting species that aren't truly native to North Carolina. And when working with private landowners, generally folks like to see things happen. A lot of these species, like I said, are tried and true. They'll come up, they'll bloom the first year. They good coverage for the soil. They do provide some pollinator benefit, but it really puts the landowner's mind at ease that, hey, you know, we're moving in the right direction. We're seeing something, and the money I spent to install this, you know, they can get some enjoyment out of it. Then as the summer kind of starts winding down into August, seeing a lot more grass component come in. By this time, the imazapic herbicide has kind of worn off. Some of the fall panicums, some of the crabgrasses, barnyard grass, things like that are starting to pop up. And we're seeing the grass component turn on now that the imazapic is, the effectiveness has dwindled through the summer. We get another little flush here in August with the Biden's Aristosa, starting to see some of the narrow leaf sunflower coming on, some bee balms, things like that. So whenever we look back in September and did kind of a count of what we had that came up the first year, we were able to identify 12 of the 19 species the first year. Most of those bloomed the first year, and then did pick up another one later on in September with the ironweed that showed up. And then since then, we probably had at least 2 or 3 other species that have bloomed on site. So roughly 14 to 16 species of the 19 that we planted did show up in the first 3 years of the project. And you can notice as we move along, the grass component has become more prevalent. And that's one of the concerns whenever we plant native grasses in these conversion projects, is that it does get pretty thick. It can impact species diversity in the long run. So we figured out that it's not quite like the poppy field on the way to the Emerald City, but just like everything, there's pluses and minuses with this type of land management. Just wanted to go through those real quickly. The pluses, to be able to get cost share from some programs, and the project I just showed you was funded with the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP. Some programs do require planting. Some don't. Generally, you get fast results by by planting seeds. You have a little bit of control over what species are in the mix and what you see out on your property. And then finally, it's fairly showy. Not poppy field showy, but we can see things the first year, and it looks like a wildflower planting. The minuses, it can be costly. Some of these mixtures range up to $800 an acre. You can get custom mixes that are even more expensive than that. You can get some that are less expensive than that, but you generally lose diversity and true nativeness as you go to a cheaper mixture. This offers limited diversity. You're killing some things in the seed bank and planting something that is going to compete with some of the fallow or volunteer things that would come on if you didn't do the planting. So it does actually limit diversity, at least for the first several years in these projects where we plant. Some of these seeds do have challenges with getting high germination. Sometimes you plant a seed and you won't see any sign of it for 2 or 3 years. And there again, that's why, in my opinion, adding some things that come up quickly so the landowner knows they're making progress is important. And most important, it does take management. This is not just a set it and forget it kind of thing. With early succession, we're kind of fighting the natural succession of things, or the natural progression of things from field to forest. So to be able to maintain these early successional habitat areas, we do have to have periodic management to set back succession. So we talked a little bit about planting. I want to come back now and talk about managing the seed And this is another project site in Randolph County where we took a retired cattle pasture. This had cows on it for years and years. Prior to us doing this seed bank management, it had probably been absence of any livestock on there for 3 or 4 years. It had been mowed twice a year just to keep the trees from coming up in it too bad. And as you can see, there's a pretty significant component of tall fescue in this pasture. So the first thing that we did to release the fallow seed bank or the volunteer seed bank was to control the non-native cool season grasses, specifically tall fescue. Fescue does form a mat. It doesn't stand up nice and tall like broom sedge, so it's a mat forming grass. It does have allelopathic control so that it does suppress other vegetation that tries to germinate and grow around it. And it is pretty aggressive as far as making dense stands that are difficult for things to come up through. So we killed that in December. It was early December. Generally, we kind of say after the second killing frost. That way we're killing the fescue. We're not killing the warm season component or the warm season species that might be growing in these areas. So we let the herbicide take effect, gave it a couple months. I think this burn happened in late March. There again, just to remove that thatch layer, kill a little more of the fescue, or at least set back a little more fescue that might not have been killed by the herbicide. Expose the seed that had been laying there dormant for some time, and expose bare mineral soil so that we could get other plants that might blow, other seeds that might blow into the area to germinate successfully. In areas where you can't burn, disking is an option that has a similar impact. It breaks up the thatch layer, breaks up the soil, exposes some seed that might have been long covered up, that might have been laying there dormant for a while, gets rid of a little bit of competition. And especially with fall disking, we can promote a diverse forb layer. We like fall disking because it doesn't seem to impact or promote agricultural weeds quite as much as spring disking does. And then you kind of see what happens. Sometimes it's a challenge to talk with landowners about, hey, let's let your field go fallow and see what comes up. Their experience with their field, sometimes they know that what's going to come up might not be what they want to see every day out their front window. There's always going to be some good and some bad come up. There again, good and bad, just like beauty, are in the eye of the beholder. So some folks can tolerate things looking a little unkempt better than other folks can. So just like with the planting natives, we have pluses and minuses with managing fallow vegetation as well. It's inexpensive to start. You can just go out and disturb an area, whether that be with herbicide, whether that be with tillage, whether that be with burning, and see what comes back. It's also not necessarily size dependent. Sometimes planting projects are more economical whenever you go to a larger scale where you're buying seed in bulk, and it's cheaper to rent drills and get herbicide applied per acre when you're applying to more acres. But with fallow vegetation, as long as you have a way to disturb the soil or remove invasive competition, you can start managing the fallow vegetation. It's higher diversity. By allowing that seed bank to come up, and you can see in this photo, we've got really nice diversity. The more diversity you have, the more species can benefit, especially insects that have very narrow host plant requirements sometimes. There again, it's easy to get started, and it maintains local genetics. So we're not bringing seed in from outside the area. It's the seed that either blew in, were brought in by wildlife, or have always been there laying, waiting in the seed bank. So it maintains that local diversity. Generally, those plants that adapted in an area will grow better in an area. But just like with everything else, if you're in the business of producing seed, you want it to be something that's going to grow, is going to grow well, and sometimes those species or those ecotypes or those varieties might not come from right here in North Carolina. They might be North Carolina native species, but they might come from Florida, Virginia. So you're bringing in outside genetics. But by maintaining or managing the volunteer or the fallow vegetation, you're keeping local genetics there. The minuses, and I saw at least one soil and water employee log in a while ago, Charlie Bass. So we know we don't like soil disturbance. So you need to make sure that when you're using soil disturbance to promote the volunteer and fallow vegetation, that you use that in the appropriate places. You don't want to cause erosion issues trying to get your habitat established. To some folks, it's unsightly. There again, some people can take a little unsightly better than others. You are going to get good things and bad things. So you are going to get some invasive species. Very few old fields and pastures in the Piedmont of North Carolina don't have a little bit of Sericea lespedeza in them. And some fields have a lot of Sericea lespedeza in them. Once you remove the fescue or the other species, the non-native species, you're going to get a flush of things coming up, some good, some bad, some native, some invasive. So you have to be ready to address those invasive species. And then finally, it requires management. Again, we're kind of fighting the natural progression of things whenever we're trying to manage for early succession in this day and age. Historically, we would have had bison and elk and other large grazing animals. We would have had naturally occurring fires. We don't have those things now, so we're always fighting the trees and the shrubs and the trees whenever we're managing early succession. Because without management, this is kind of what these fields want to transition back to. Sweet gum is one of the things that we're always fighting. Several different species of pine, all the pioneer species that want to get in these areas and start growing quickly, they will without frequent disturbance. And as you can see, the difference between, let's see if it's going to take me, let me go back or not here. The diversity whenever we're getting full sunlight with periodic disturbance versus the amount of ground cover that's here, hands down, much less diversity, much less vegetation for browse, much less vegetation for cover. This is what will happen to your early succession area without fairly aggressive management. So if you wait on these issues to show up, you wind up with a very thick stand of low quality hardwood trees, usually with some pine mixed in. And it takes major work to set that back. In this photo, the landowner came in and actually did some brush saw work to cut down the stand of trees. In the previous photo, just trying to reset that vegetation, get some sprouts coming up that would be beneficial for browse, kind of create a brush pile there from that down debris. There again, it took a fairly major effort to catch back up once this area became a young forest. So trying to use selective herbicides early on get the problems before they become major problems. Selective herbicides are good tools to use because you can apply and kill the entire plant. You're not simply cutting it off so that it will continue to stump sprout again and again, and you'll be fighting the same thing over and over again. Fairly selective herbicide formulations and application methods can kill your target species without harming a lot of the vegetation around the target species. But it is okay to have some of these openings. New things will colonize those areas, which will help with expanding species diversity. So you will see a different kind of plant come in for the first year or two after these areas are killed with herbicide. And then depending on the scale of your project, you might wind up using some fairly extreme methods to control woody vegetation. The other option, once trees get to this size, would be to cut the tree down and treat the stump. That way you've got a nice brush pile and you've killed that stump so it won't come back again. There again, that's a very good selective use of herbicide. With the cut stump treatment, you cut it down, treat the stump, you don't impact any of the surrounding vegetation, and you don't have to deal with this tree stump sprouting later on as well. One of the preferred methods for maintaining early successional habitat is fire. Prescribed burning is a natural occurrence. We would have had natural fires either by lightning strikes or Native American activity pre-European settlement. A lot of the species that we're promoting in these early successional areas are very well adapted to handle fire. Timing of fire is very important in getting better control over woody species. For example, anytime from now through late October, kind of a late growing season burn, provides good control of hardwood trees and pine trees that might be coming up in these early successional areas. If you wait until after the trees go dormant during the wintertime, you will be able to top kill some of these trees. However, they'll just stump sprout and be right back for you to deal with later on next spring. So timing your burn, varying the time of your burns can also help to build diversity in these early successional areas. And mowing is an option. It's probably the easiest option for most people to do. However, if you notice in this photo, mowing causes thatch. And just like putting pine needles down in your yard to suppress weeds, the thatch from mowing and the mat of thatch from mowing will suppress a lot of the species that would germinate just because it's got layers of grass clippings on top of it. There again, we often try to get landowners to either disc or burn and then follow up with mowing if it's a better fit for their objectives from an aesthetic standpoint. Having areas that are left uncut, unburned, or undisc each year helps add to the diversity of the plant community as well, and certainly something to consider. So mowing is an option, but the other methods will be better from a habitat and plant diversity standpoint. And whenever you put these things together, we can have a fairly diverse early successional habitat for pollinators, early successional birds, small mammals, rabbits, deer, nesting and brooding areas for turkeys. And this is a pretty good example of some of the typical projects I work with. There are some non-natives in here. There's some Cerisa lespedeza. Looks like maybe a paspalum grass there. but all in all, the structure's there. It's dominated more by native species than non-native species. And, you know, there's a lot of things that will utilize this habitat type. The other thing that I generally get complaints about is my promotion of herbicide. And, you know, to be real honest, with the wide range of non-native invasive species that we have on the landscape now, a lot of perennial warm season grasses such as Bermuda grass that may persist in some of these old fields and old pastures. Some of this conversion organically can be a challenge, but I always like to make sure that folks know it is an option. A lot of it has to do with the scale of your project. Large scale organic can be a challenge. Certainly strips like on this on the photo on this manual are good opportunities to use organic methods to establish native vegetation and wildflowers. And the Xerces Society publishes this publication. It's really nice publication about organic methods. And especially they've got this chart, this table in that book that it's really easy to understand, and it's got a good variety of options for organic site preparation. Site preparation is very critical in getting these projects to work right. And of course, like I mentioned, there's times when this works well and there's times when it doesn't. And, you know, by making sure you're using the correct methodology for site preparation will certainly help your project be much more successful. So with that, I wanted to go through a few species that are likely to show up whenever you manage the fallow vegetation, and some things that you could plant in your projects as well. Pokeweed. Nobody likes to see it on the side of their white car, but it's very important from a songbird standpoint. It's a really important food source for songbirds. It's a high value browse for deer and a preferred browse for deer. So it's an excellent plant that will show up in these early successional projects. Beggar's lice or tick trefoil. We really don't do ourselves any favor naming these plants. We've got weeds and we've got lice. So beggar's lice, very important food source for songbirds, bobwhite quail. It's certainly a browse plant for deer. It is available commercially for including in seed mixtures as well. Biden's aristosa, another one of the common names is tick seed. It's one of the tried and true. It does well in planted mixtures. It's blooming right now. You see it on power line right-of-ways. Very common to see it come up in both volunteer sites, volunteer fallow vegetation sites, as well as available commercially to include in seed mixtures. Another weed, ironweed, very important from a pollinator standpoint. Good host plant. It can live in drier sites. It seems to favor a more moist areas, but it is available to purchase to include in planted mixtures as well. Ragweed, very important seed food source for songbirds, and also very high protein deer browse. Some numbers up to 19% crude protein, and deer browse it very readily. It's a preferred food source in most locations. Butterfly weed or butterfly milkweed, another very important host plant for monarch butterfly, very important nectar source for a wide range of pollinators, bees and butterflies. Goldenrod, some goldenrods are starting to bloom now. A lot of it will really be showing up in the next 2 or 3 weeks. Deer will browse it. It's another good nectar plant from a pollinator standpoint. Small flower partridge pea or sensitive pea, also the showy partridge pea or lark partridge pea, which is a little more aggressive, taller growing, more robust plant with a larger bloom. But partridge pea, good browse for deer. Rabbits will clip it and eat it. Important food source for songbirds and quail, and especially the larger bloom species do get visited by pollinators quite a bit. Passion flower, another very important pollinator species. Seems like bumblebees and carpenter bees really do love this species. Finally, sensitive vine. Not that it's that great from a deer browse standpoint. It's got little thorns and briars on it, but it's a pretty cool plant. Makes a wicked looking seed pod, and any plant that responds to touch is pretty cool, I think. So whenever you touch the leaves of this thing, it closes up pretty tight. So it's kind of getting to the point that I'll wrap up here. You know, when we talk about habitat, it all comes down to species needs, whether it's a viable habitat or not. On private lands, we have to balance the species needs with the landowner objective. And of course, like every slide previous, when we ask the question, who makes these decisions on private lands, it's always going to be the landowner. The scale of the project, you know, the amount that you're willing to do, are you willing to do it? All these are things that you need to ask yourself and know what you're getting into, and know what the realistic benefit of your management is going to be for local wildlife. For example, if you had a field like this, maybe the economic or financial value of the edge of the field, you know, maybe it's actually costing you or your farmer money to plant that outside 30 feet of that field. Maybe that would be a great place to do some pollinator or fallow management. You know, soften that edge, allow some fallow vegetation to come up, quit putting fertilizer, herbicide, and seed out there on that narrow strip, and let it serve a different purpose on your property. There again, it all goes back to each property is different, each landowner is different, but there are opportunities on most tracts of land to have a positive wildlife benefit without having a negative income or financial impact. So whether it be a 30-foot buffer, a 10-foot buffer, a backyard project, or, you know, a 50 or 60 acre project, or even bigger than that, early successional habitat is important for lots of different species. It is a decline in habitat type in North Carolina. The species that depend on this habitat type, many of them are in a long-term decline in population numbers. And you get to see a lot of different things utilizing these habitat types if you wanted to convert some of your current agricultural land, old pastures or current pastures, to native vegetation, or manage it for a more diverse fallow vegetation. And with that, that's the end, I guess the ends, and that's my contact information. And I think that we have a little bit of time now for questions, and Charles or somebody will let me know what I need to do to unshare my screen, if that's how you want to proceed from here.
Sure. If you want to unshare your screen, there should be a little button, red button says unshare at the top. There you go.
All right.
I do have a couple questions in the chat box. Let's do those first, if you don't mind, John.
Okay.
First one is there anything you can do to slow grass from overtaking forbs in just a few years?
There is. What we generally do is, first and foremost, we reduce the amount of grass that we plant in the mixtures. And I can see the person that's asking that, I think, and we're actually preparing some mixtures for that landowner. But in recent years, we've really reduced the amount of grass that we include in the initial plantings. Look at maybe shifting the burning regime. Burning seems to favor grass over forbs, so we reduce the burning regime, and there's some selective herbicides that will kill grasses and not forbs. So those are generally the method that we use. The disking will also break up the root systems of the grasses and promote and allow more forbs to come into the area.
Okay. Thank you. The next question in the chat says, can you say more about the specific management techniques used to prevent succession to forest?
Yeah, there again, all the same management tools that I mentioned during the presentation: disking, burning, selective herbicide use. All those things are going to be needed in one form or another. A disturbance, whether that be disking, burning, or mowing. But the selective herbicide is really important. And there again, in my opinion, I've seen places that you could burn every year or two and you still wind up with a woody plant component coming in. Persimmon are really resistant to fire, even young persimmon. So it really takes fairly frequent disturbance, and also, selecting the proper places to do your early successional habitat work. You don't want to go on your most fertile site. Bottomlands historically were hardwood trees, and if you go into those areas and try to fight the forest succession there, it's going to continually be a challenge. So picking the higher drier sites, the lower fertility sites, you generally work real well, and just staying on top of your selective herbicide use and your disturbance to not let the forest get ahead of you.
Sometimes that can be tough with things like sweet gun out there. So Paul McKenzie did put a couple of links to the Xerxes Society and their checklists. So if anyone wants to right-click those and save those links somewhere, but feel free to do that. Next question is, does beggar's lice make a 5-foot tall woody shrub?
On a real fertile site, it certainly could. I don't know that I've seen it quite that aggressive. It could be another type of Lespedeza, or another type of legume that would look similar. Not saying it couldn't, but it would take a pretty fertile site to get that kind of height.
And usually it's just a tall stem going up with a large inflorescence on top of it, I think. So.
Well, and it can form a pretty good mound. When I got those photos yesterday, there were some mounds that were, 3 feet across, but it had come up and kind of laid over with some support from adjacent vegetation. So
Okay. Next question is, how large an area is needed to get CRP assistance, and is there a link?
Um, I'm not sure what the minimum is. The CRP does have some requirements that it has to be on actively cropped land. There are some other farm bill programs that might be a better fit. I would just suggest, you can feel free to reach out to me on an individual basis or contact your local Natural Resource Conservation Service office or Farm Service Agency office to get details on those programs. But I would be glad to give some information on individual cases if somebody wanted to reach out to me.
Okay, yeah, and the best thing to do is check with the NRCS on that too, and they do have other programs available for conservation, like EQIP. Next question, how much land is needed to support a small group of bobwhite quail?
That's a good question, and it's kind of odd that we've had such luck with wild turkey and white-tailed deer over the years with reestablishing and managing those species, but a 6-ounce bird gives us so much challenge. A lot of it has to do with the surrounding area. If you had property in an agricultural dominated area with lots of early successional habitat on the landscape, you may be able to have a group of birds utilize your property. Even if it was 30 or 40 acres, you might be able to have a group of birds that hangs out there part of the time. If you're in a dense forested stand, suburban areas, and you have 50 acres of really high quality early succession habitat, chances are you're not going to be able to support a covey of quail for very long. They're just, everything's wanting to eat them, and they're very, very specific about their habitat.
Very true. They do take a surprisingly large acreage to support.
It's certainly a landscape, it's a landscape scale concern, and from a private land standpoint, it usually takes multiple landowners working in cooperation to be able to impact the population locally.
Right. All right. Next question. What herbicide do you recommend for stump application for pear trees?
All right. I'm a fan of triclopyr products. That would be they have triclopyr 3A and 4. I think 4 is the one that's labeled for stump treatment. Cut the tree down, coming up into a good period of time of the year where cutting and then immediately treating the stump kind of allows that herbicide to get sucked down into the root system, and it does real well killing the root system. So triclopyr, you can use full concentration glyphosate can do the same thing. So generally the labeled rate for that is like a 50-50 solution of either herbicide and water, or with triclopyr 4, I think it's the herbicide and diesel fuel or some kind of oily surfactant.
Okay. We still got questions coming in. We'll do these quickly. This next one might be better suited for next week when we're talking about invasives. But any suggestions for dealing with Chinese privet?
Yeah, privet, you have to jump on it as soon as you can see it. It's an evergreen broadleaf, so it's actually one of my favorite invasives because you can spray it during the cool season when everything else is dormant. Triclopyr 3A is another good herbicide that generally does a good job controlling that. It's going to take multiple treatments because there are seeds there waiting to germinate when you kill the bigger plants. Using cut stump treatment or hack and squirt on large plants can also be a good way. And we will talk more about that next week.
Okay. Paul McKenzie did put a link up to Conservation Reserve Program information. Thank you for doing that, Paul. Any particular herbicides recommended for killing young trees with minimal impact to desired forage species?
The triclopyr is the broadleaf selective, so it generally will kill the broadleaf component without hurting the grass component. I'm not aware of any herbicide that you could use that would kill the woody component or young trees that would not kill most broadleaf forbs, except for some legumes. So there again, I've got if that participant would shoot me an email, I've got a really simple to understand chart that might be able to help answer that question.
All right. Would you mind typing your email in the chat, John? And Paul McKenzie spelled triclopyr for us. It does have a Y at the end of it. There's a lot of trade names for it. That is the active ingredient name. And I don't see any more questions. There's John's address, email if anybody wants to contact him directly with a burning issue, I guess, on that. Got 1 minute left. We'd scheduled about an hour. I know sometimes these things do run over if we get a lot of questions going. We appreciate that. We are recording this. At some point, we'll try to get the recordings available, and we'll let folks know, because I did have an email from a participant that was having trouble staying in the room with us. So I just want to make that, let everybody know that. Okay, any one or two more questions we got time for? Although it is 2 o'clock. I'm not hearing any. Don't see any more in the chat box. So I hope everyone's enjoyed today's session. This is an indication of how the rest of the series is going to go. This is going to be great for everybody. I certainly enjoyed it. John, I want to thank you so much for being here with us today. Great job covering the early succession, and knowing that some of these plants we call weeds do have a greater purpose, I guess is one way to put it. But again, I learned a lot from it. Hope everyone else did. And thank you again for that. We look forward to seeing you next week. Charles, anything you want to say?
Just thank you, John, and I look forward to seeing everybody next week and hearing what else you have to add, John. The day was great. Thank you.
All right. Very good. So whoever hit the record button, I think, can hit it again to stop the recording.